Well. Seems like we're back to this background, eh? Well, why not? This particular YouTuber is called Jon Solo. He's a YouTuber based in Florida. Yeah, he was based in Florida. And I just thought, why don't I react to him? He had uploaded a video. Basically, the background is that most of his videos are in a video series called Messed Up Origins. His most popular series is Disney Explained, which is self-explanatory, based on, Disney movies. Breaks down the stories that have inspired the films, which have been adapted from those stories. He also has other series called Mythology Explained, which is about Greek mythologies, Roman mythologies, any mythologies from the ancient world. He also does Fables Explained, which is about fables, and you get the picture. I just thought, why don't I react to a video that he just uploaded? It's about John Henry. Since the actual video that he uploaded is like 16 minutes, and I ended up reacting to it for 45 minutes, you are only going to see highlights of my reaction to his video. If you want to watch the rest of Jon Solo's video, the link will be in the description box down below. Before you watch the rest of this video, hit the thumbs up, dislike if you want to as well. I don't really care at this point. Hit subscribe, the bell, comment down below, follow me on social media, my Spotify account, my podcast, everything. In fact, I may turn this reaction video into a podcast at some point. I'll stop rambling now and get on with today's video.
However, last week I saw a comment suggesting I cover him for Black History Month, and I thought, alright, let's fucking do it.
Black History Month in America, in case you didn't notice, he's from Chicago in the Mideast. Not that it matters, but in the case of Black History Month, because I live in London, UK, and so we celebrate Black History Month on October. America, on the other hand, they celebrate Black History Month in February. So, yeah.
I noticed to the grindstone, started researching, and found that a historian named Scott Reynolds Nelson had not only written a very in-depth book about the folk hero, he may have found the true identity of John Henry, and along with it, the true story of the legend. Thanks to his incredible work, I was able to put this episode together and deliver a streamlined version of John Henry's origins that isn't built entirely on speculation and conjecture. Don't get me wrong, there's always going to be some speculation involved when studying the past, but when it comes to John Henry, this is about as conclusive as it gets.
By the way, what's that video?
That like button with your 20-pound hammer, subscribe for more content like this on a weekly basis, and of
Paul
course,
Bunyan.
enjoy.
Alright, cool. And I really liked it, because I'm a dedicated fan.
Let's start with a rundown of his story. John Henry's legend began circulating in the 1870s in the form of a ballad that hammermen on the railroad sang to keep a steady pace as they worked. For years and years, his story was passed around between laborers of all kinds, dock workers, coal miners, lumberjacks, etc., who each put their own unique spin on it, but never bothered to write it down. There's also 4 key components one usually finds in each
so it's basically about this dude dying, just to try something out.
Results of his legendary race against the steam hammer, Henry's death and burial, and the reaction of his wife. Wanting to stay true to form, each of these components was actually included in the animated short Disney produced about the ballad back in 2000, as well as some added backstory to John Henry's character. That isn't to say it's not true, though. In fact, the reality could be even worse than the story we're familiar with. John Henry was more than just a victim of slavery. He suffered the brunt of racial injustice throughout the majority of his short life, which he spent almost entirely in chains. In the spirit of that, in the sections that follow, we're not only going to shed some light on who John Henry may have really been, but also the horrible conditions he had to endure on the railroad and how he really lost his life.
Yeah. If John Henry really was a slave, well, I mean, the racism is real. Don't get me wrong, guys. Racism is all but gone. We think about the obvious parts of it, but the obscure parts of it, no, it hasn't gone. They haven't gone. And us in Britain like to think that we're not as bad as America, but then again, we did start it with the slave trade. So I say we. I'm not even a UK citizen, but I lived in this country for more than 10 years, so it doesn't matter. I mentioned in one of my videos that I was not going to talk about politics or what I believe in, regardless of being politics, religion, anything, unless the time calls. I mean, we are watching a video which is loosely based on the politics of the time, if you could even think of it as such. So it kind of makes a bit of sense that I am talking a bit about it, but this is about John Henry. It's not about me, so let's just move on, alright?
Life to a steam-powered drill, but not in the way everyone thinks. So to track down the identity of John Henry, the first thing one has to know is where to look. And while the ballad never explicitly says where it takes place, many experts agree that West Virginia is the most likely location. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway was building a massive new track in West Virginia that went through the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio River. And two, it was on this very track that some of the very first steam drills in America were used. Now, depending on what version of the song you hear, John Henry was usually one of three things: a free man who was indentured to the railroad company, a newly freed former slave, or a prison inmate being forced to work as he serves his time. Well, according to some old records at the Virginia State Penitentiary, there just so happened to be an inmate named John Henry who was leased to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway mentioned. Here on your screen, you can see a recreation of his official prison records. Some of the most notable details are that he was born in New Jersey, only 19 years old, and he stood at a whopping 5'1" and 1/4 inches tall.
Jeez, nah. So he was a year older than me, yet I'm way taller than him.
You heard that right. Your man was a short kid.
He was arrested for breaking into the house, in larceny.
If you're like me, you're probably surprised to hear that because the ballad always portrays him as this giant hulk of a man. Before being arrested and forced to drive steel, it's believed that John Henry worked in a camp for the Union military and was down in Virginia on assignment. At 5'1", he would have been too short to be a soldier, but he may have worked as a cook or laborer in some other capacity. Now, you may have also noticed that John's record said he was serving 10 years for housebreak and larceny, meaning he broke into someone's house and stole something they owned. And if you're thinking that 10 years sounds like an awfully long time,
basically, he's in jail for robbery.
Sentence a 19-year-old to prison for a non-violent crime, you would be right. But a fact that might not surprise you is that immediately after the Civil War, the court system...
Oh yeah, because, he's black. Give him more time than they would to his white counterparts. I mean, that is part of the racism.
In the southern United States was about as corrupt and racist as you could get. You see, in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended, Virginia instituted what came to be called black codes, set of laws made for the sole purpose of incarcerating as many of the newly freed African Americans as possible.
Why?
Prohibited vagrancy, which was defined as the flooding of black men and women into public spaces. It was illegal for black men and women to be without employers. African Americans weren't allowed to testify against whites. And it was now illegal for blacks to have an air of satisfaction.
What the heck does that mean? It means that America is so racist as
meaning they couldn't show delight about the end of the Civil War. Because how dare they be satisfied that their people were no longer slaves? Shame on them. Really. And on top of all this, punishments for property crimes increased dramatically. Valued at more than $20, was now punishable with 5 to 10 years in prison instead of 1 to 5.
What did you say?
For example, stealing goods valued at more than $20 was now punishable with 5 to 10 years in prison instead of 1 to 5.
Oh, so white people only served half the time that black people did back then.
$20 was considered significantly more back then, but still, 5 to 10 years? Too much. And what makes it even worse is that even though it's what he was punished for, John Henry never broke into someone's house in the dead of night and stole over $20 worth of goods. Actually, all he did was shoplift from a general store called Wiseman's Grocery.
He was even sentenced for the right crime. Not only did he go to prison, he served 5 to 10 years, which is double that of a white person. He didn't even break into a house. He broke into a shop. That does not carry the same weight as, breaking into someone's house, alright?
So I'm just going to give you my oversimplified version of what happened. A few shitty people in power did a few shitty things with their power. That includes the judge who saw that Henry's charges were far too severe for his crime, so he gave the plaintiff more...
No, that is so stupid.
time to collect evidence to use against him, and a guy named Charles Byrd, the assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, who instead of giving aid to the newly freed slaves like he was supposed to, sought to put as many behind bars as possible. So fun fact, Charles Byrd also had severe brain damage from being shot in the head with a musket ball by one of his own men during the Civil War. The ball embedded itself 4 inches deep into Byrd's skull, damaging his frontal lobe and giving him lead poisoning. So he's definitely not the guy you want in charge of literally anything. So in November of 1866, after the 19-year-old John Henry received his sentence, he was sent to the Virginia State Penitentiary, which at the time was undergoing some major renovations at the hands of the new warden, Bertram Wardwell. And while some of Wardwell's decisions are questionable, he's one of the few people in this story I can confidently say had good intentions. He was a former ice merchant who had been held in a Confederate prison for 2 years because he supported the Union. And after his first visit to the Virginia Penitentiary, which he was to oversee, he was horrified at its condition. The living spaces were filthy, the food tasted like ass, the cells were overcrowded, and to top it all off, the prison was seriously in debt. His solution for these problems was to lease his inmates year-round to railroad contractors in the Virginia mountains. That way he could raise some money, and he would have more space in the prison to make improvements. To his credit, he made sure the conditions on the railroad were adequate too. He visited one himself and found that inmates' living quarters were cleaner than the prisons, and the food was better, so he thought he was doing something right. What he didn't expect was for efficiency and deadlines to eventually become top priorities, and for the inmates to be forced to work in incredibly deadly conditions as a result. Within the first 3 months of the program, 225 convicts were leased to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, and a few years later, on December 1st, 1868, at the age of 21, John Henry was sent to work. He was what's called a hammer man or a steel driving man. His job was to turn big rocks into little rocks and to hand drill the holes they'd place dynamite into. So now the question is, which of the C&O tunnels was John Henry working on when he faced off against the steam drill? And there's 2 options that experts suggest most often: Big Bend Tunnel and Lewis Tunnel. However, Scout Reynolds Nelson gives us enough evidence to rule out one of those. According to some engineering reports he dug up, the contractor in charge of the Big Bend Tunnel didn't use steam drills because he didn't trust them, and the rock in that part of the mountain wasn't hard enough to deem it necessary. Since the inclusion of the steam drill is vital for John Henry's story, we can almost guarantee that he didn't work on the Big Bend Tunnel.
So he worked at Lewis Tunnel.
In front of the tunnel, that much more awkward. However, we know that for the Lewis Tunnel, drills were sought out immediately over concerns about the efficiency of the inmates and their ability to penetrate the exceptionally hard rock in Lewis Mountain. So this is where the steam drill part of the legend comes in, where you can start connecting dots between what's fact and what's folklore. Even though they were advertised as being cheaper and more efficient than manual labor, steam drills had a lot of problems as a result of the insane amount of dust they generated clogging up.
Looks like a pneumatic drill, twice its height, propped up by a tripod.
The inner workings of the machine. As a result, they would often break down, and the railway would have to send in a crew to work alongside the machine.
That
or
looks
even
dangerous.
2
That
crews to make
definitely
up
looks
the
dangerous.
deficit. After months of dealing with malfunctions on a regular basis and deadlines approaching fast, it got to a point where the men in charge just had to face the fact that the drills weren't doing them any favors, and the rest of Lewis Tunnel was built with hammermen like John Henry. So when the ballad says Henry proved he could outwork the dreaded steam drill, it really means it. Only in reality, there wasn't a single contest to determine that. Rather, the evidence slapped them across the face repeatedly for months. It also wasn't just John Henry who proved it, it was all of the inmates who worked on the railroad. But John, the ballad also says that Henry died while defeating the steam drill. Is there
did die,
any
right?
truth to that? Good question. There is, but what actually happened is even sadder. So you're going to want to brace yourself for what's next.
Bloody hell. It's gonna be Hello Doctor's my old friend all over
The
again.
reason we're confident that John Henry died on the railroad and not in prison is because his name isn't mentioned on any surgeon reports, and he just disappears from prison records without any mention of parole, escape, or release. We also know that line of work was incredibly dangerous. Just between September 1871 and September of the next year, 380 African-American convicts were released to the railroad, and 150 of them died from an injury or illness they obtained while working. It's also possible that Henry died from a tunnel collapse or explosion, but judging from the autopsies of the fellow workers, and even more likely cause may have been lung disease. The inmates were forced to work right next to these drills as they were spitting out dust without any protective gear. And even after
That's
the
sad.
drills were done being used because they just didn't work right, the inmates continued to breathe in those tiny microscopic fragments that were floating around in the tunnels for the next 2 years until the job was completed. So yeah, like the story says, John Henry did die working alongside a steam drill, but it wasn't immediate. He didn't die of exhaustion or heart failure, but instead a lung disease that slowly strangled him from the inside for a period of 6 months to 2 years. The ballad is pretty spot on with this one too, at least if you read the right one. There's some versions that claim he was buried under the railroad tracks, but others say he was buried by the White House. This was not a reference to the president's home, but rather a mass grave that was discovered by the only white building at the Virginia State Penitentiary, the Workshop. Forensic anthropologists at the Smithsonian Institution studied the 300 bodies from that grave and found that approximately 80% of them were black men in their early 20s, the exact demographic of the inmates most commonly sold to the railroad. So it's not a guarantee, but what most likely happened is that John Henry's lung disease got the best of him and he died on the construction site, then his body was shipped back to the prison and he was buried in the mass grave. For whatever reason, the guy still hammering away in the tunnel incorporated his name into their hammer songs, his story caught on, and just a few decades later, country and blues artists were recording their own renditions in the studio, immortalizing John Henry forever. I think Scott Reynolds Nelson put it best. What started as a haunting burial song became a song about many things. John Henry was appropriated to tell the story about the position of black men during Jim Crow, about the joys and pains of the life of trackliners, about the dangers of mining, about blind men robbed of their power to see, about the coming of the machine age, about nostalgia for the past, about the terrors of textile mills, about capitalism, and about the Black Power movement. It has become a story of courage and conflict with power, but it started as a tool used to dig tunnels and line track to set a pace that protected railway workers' lives. And that, my friends, was the very messed up origin of John Henry. I hope it didn't press it too hard. Normally I like to inject some humor into these stories to offset how morbid they are, but call me crazy, it just didn't feel like the right move for this episode. Regardless, I hope you were entertained by it, learned yourself something, and got a little bit of satisfaction out of having your questions about John Henry answered. In all seriousness, I could have made this episode a lot longer than it turned out being. I left out some details that, while definitely not necessary, may have enhanced the story a bit. So if you have any remaining questions, or you just want to see a part 2 to this episode, let me know in the comments.
If you like this video, then hit the thumbs up. You can hit the thumbs down to dislike as well if you want to. I don't really care at this point. Subscribe, hit the bell, comment down below. Follow me on social media, my Spotify account, my podcast as well. This video may have a podcast version soon, hopefully. I'll let you know when I end up releasing this as a podcast in due course. Anyways, white yellow and goodbye.
Just levitate.